Kin selection is the evolutionary strategy that favors the reproductive success of an organism's relatives, even at a cost to the organism's own survival and reproduction. Kin altruism is altruistic behavior whose evolution is driven by kin selection. Kin selection is an instance of inclusive fitness, which combines the number of offspring produced with the number an individual can produce by supporting others, such as siblings. Charles Darwin discussed the concept of kin selection in his 1859 book The Origin of Species, where he reflected on the puzzle of sterile social insects, such as honey bees, which leave reproduction to their sisters, arguing that a selection benefit to related organisms would allow the evolution of a trait that confers the benefit but destroys an individual at the same time. R.A. Fisher in 1930 and J.B.S. in 1964, W.D. Hamilton popularized the concept and the major advance in the mathematical treatment of the phenomenon by George R. Price, which has become known as Hamilton's rule. In the same year, John Maynard Smith used the actual term kin selection for the first time. According to Hamilton's rule, kin selection causes genes to increase in frequency when the genetic relatedness of a recipient to an actor multiplied by the benefit to the recipient is greater than the reproductive cost to the actor. The rule is difficult to test, but a study of red squirrels in 2010 found that adoption of orphans by surrogate mothers in the wild occurred only when the conditions of Hamilton's rule were met. Hamilton proposed two mechanisms for kin selection: kin recognition, where individuals are able to identify their relatives, and viscous populations, where dispersal is rare enough for populations to be closely related. The viscous population mechanism makes kin selection and social cooperation possible in the absence of kin recognition. Nurture kinship, the treatment of individuals as kin when they live together, is sufficient for kin selection, given reasonable assumptions about dispersal rates. Kin selection is not the same thing as group selection, where natural selection acts on the group as a whole. In humans, altruism is more likely and on a larger scale with kin than with unrelated individuals. For example, humans give presents according to how closely related they are to the recipient. In other species, vervet monkeys use allomothering, where related females such as older sisters or grandmothers often care for young, according to their relatedness. The social shrimp Synalpheus regalis protects juveniles within highly related colonies. Historical overview. Charles Darwin was the first to discuss the concept of kin selection. In The Origin of Species, he wrote clearly about the conundrum represented by altruistic sterile social insects, that this difficulty, though appearing insuperable, is lessened, or, as I believe, disappears, when it is remembered that selection may be applied to the family, as well as to the individual, and may thus gain the desired end. Breeders of cattle wish the flesh and fat to be well marbled together. An animal thus characterized has been slaughtered, but the breeder has gone, with confidence, to the same stock and has succeeded. Darwin in this passage, the family, and stock, stand for a kin group. These passages and others by Darwin about kin selection are highlighted in D.J. Futuyma's textbook of reference Evolutionary Biology and in E. O. Wilson's Sociobiology. The earliest mathematically formal treatments of kin selection were by R.A. Fisher in 1930 and J.B.S. Haldane in 1932 and 1955. J.B.S. Haldane fully grasped the basic quantities and considerations in kin selection, famously writing, "I would lay down my life for 2 brothers, or 8 cousins." Haldane's remark alluded to the fact that if an individual loses its life to save 2 siblings, 4 nephews, or 8 cousins, it is a fair deal, in evolutionary terms, as siblings are on average 50% identical by descent, nephews 25%, and cousins 12.5%. But Haldane also joked that he would truly die only to save more than a single identical twin of his or more than 2 full siblings. In 1955 he clarified, Let us suppose that you carry a rare gene that affects your behavior so that you jump into a flooded river and save a child. But you have 1 chance in 10 of being drowned, while I do not possess the gene, and stand on the bank and watch the child drown. If the child's your own child or your brother or sister, there is an even chance that this child will also have this gene. So 5 genes will be saved in children for 1 lost in an adult. If you save a grandchild or a nephew, the advantage is only 2.5 to 1. If you only save a first cousin, the effect is very slight. If you try to save your first cousin once removed, the population is more likely to lose this valuable gene than to gain it. It is clear that genes making for conduct of this kind would only have a chance of spreading in rather small populations when most of the children were fairly near relatives of the man who risked his life. W.D. Hamilton, in 1963 and especially in 1964, popularized the concept and the more thorough mathematical treatment given to it by George Price. John Maynard Smith may have coined the actual term, kin selection, in 1964. These processes I will call kin selection and group selection respectively. Kin selection has been discussed by Haldane and by Hamilton. By kin selection I mean the evolution of characteristics which favor the survival of close relatives of the affected individual. By processes which do not require any discontinuities in the population breeding structure. Kin selection causes changes in gene frequency across generations, driven by interactions between related individuals. This dynamic forms the conceptual basis of the theory of social evolution. Some cases of evolution by natural selection can only be understood by considering how biological relatives influence each other's fitness. Under natural selection, a gene encoding a trait that enhances the fitness of each individual carrying it should increase in frequency within the population, and conversely, a gene that lowers the individual fitness of its carriers should be eliminated. However, a hypothetical gene that prompts behavior which enhances the fitness of relatives but lowers that of the individual displaying the behavior, may nonetheless increase in frequency, because relatives often carry the same gene. According to this principle, the enhanced fitness of relatives can at times more than compensate for the fitness loss incurred by the individuals displaying the behavior, making kin selection possible. This is a special case of a more general model, inclusive fitness. This analysis has been challenged. Wilson writing that the foundations of the general theory of inclusive fitness based on the theory of kin selection have crumbled, and that he now relies instead on the theory of eusociality and gene-cultural coevolution for the underlying mechanics of sociobiology. Kin selection should not be confused with group selection, according to which a genetic trait can become prevalent within a group because it benefits the group as a whole, regardless of any benefit to individual organisms. All known forms of group selection conform to the principle that an individual behavior can be evolutionarily successful only if the genes responsible for this behavior conform to Hamilton's rule, and hence, on balance and in the aggregate, benefit from the behavior. Hamilton's rule. Formally, genes should increase in frequency when where R equals the genetic relatedness of the recipient to the actor, often defined as the probability that a gene picked randomly from each at the same locus is identical by descent. B equals the additional reproductive benefit gained by the recipient of the altruistic act. C equals the reproductive cost to the individual performing the act. This inequality is known as Hamilton's rule after W. D. Hamilton, who in 1964 published the first formal quantitative treatment of kin selection. The relatedness parameter in Hamilton's rule was introduced in 1922 by Sewell Wright as a coefficient of relationship that gives the probability that at a random locus, the alleles there will be identical by descent. Subsequent authors, including Hamilton, sometimes reformulate this with a regression, which, unlike probabilities, can be negative. A regression analysis producing statistically significant negative relationships indicates that two individuals are less genetically alike than two random ones. This has been invoked to explain the evolution of spiteful behavior consisting of acts that result in harm, or loss of fitness, to both the actor and the recipient. There has been little empirical support for Hamilton's rule in wild animals, as it is hard to quantify the costs and benefits of different behaviors. The first study to test Hamilton's rule successfully was in 2010, involving a wild population of red squirrels in Yukon, Canada. The researchers found that surrogate mothers would adopt related orphan squirrel pups but not unrelated orphans. The researchers calculated the cost of adoption by measuring a decrease in the survival probability of the entire litter after increasing the litter by one pup, while benefit was measured as the increased chance of survival of the orphan. The degree of relatedness of the orphan and surrogate mother for adoption to occur depended on the number of pups the surrogate mother already had in her nest, as this affected the cost of adoption. The study showed that females always adopted orphans when Rb greater than C, but never adopted when Rb less than C, providing strong support for Hamilton's rule. Mechanisms. Altruism occurs where the instigating individual suffers a fitness loss while the receiving individual experiences a fitness gain. The sacrifice of one individual to help another is an example. Hamilton outlined two ways in which kin selection altruism could be favored. The selective advantage, which makes behavior conditional in the right sense on the discrimination of factors which correlate with the relationship of the individual concerned, is therefore obvious. It may be, for instance, that in respect of a certain social action performed towards neighbors indiscriminately, an individual is only just breaking even in terms of inclusive fitness. If he could learn to recognize those of his neighbors who really were close relatives and could devote his beneficial actions to them alone, then advantage to inclusive fitness would at once appear. Thus a mutation causing such discriminatory behavior itself benefits inclusive fitness and would be selected. In fact, the individual may not need to perform any discrimination so sophisticated as we suggest here, a difference in the generosity of his behavior, according to whether the situations evoking it were encountered near to, or far from, his own home, might occasion an advantage of a similar kind, kin recognition. First, if individuals have the capacity to recognize kin and to discriminate on the basis of kinship, then the average relatedness of the recipients of altruism could be high enough for kin selection. Because of the facultative nature of this mechanism, kin recognition and discrimination are expected to be unimportant except among higher forms of life such as the fish Neolum prologus pulcher. Note also that kin recognition may be selected for inbreeding avoidance, and little evidence indicates that innate kin recognition plays a role in mediating altruism. A thought experiment on the kin recognition discrimination distinction is the hypothetical green beard, where a gene for social behavior is imagined also to cause a distinctive phenotype that can be recognized by other carriers of the gene. Due to conflicting genetic similarity in the rest of the genome, there would be selection pressure for green-beard altruistic sacrifices to be suppressed, making common ancestry the most likely form of inclusive fitness. Viscous populations. Secondly, even indiscriminate altruism may be favored in viscous populations with low rates or short ranges of dispersal. Here, social partners are typically genealogically close kin, and so altruism can flourish even in the absence of kin recognition and kin discrimination faculties, spatial proximity and circumstantial cues, serving as a rudimentary form of discrimination. This suggests a rather general explanation for altruism. Directional selection always favors those with higher rates of fecundity within a certain population. Social individuals can often enhance the survival of their own kin by participating in and following the rules of their own group. Hamilton later modified his thinking to suggest that an innate ability to recognize actual genetic relatedness was unlikely to be the dominant mediating mechanism for kin altruism. But once again, we do not expect anything describable as an innate kin recognition adaptation used for social behavior other than mating, for the reasons already given in the hypothetical case of the trees. Hamilton's later clarifications often go unnoticed, and because of the long-standing assumption that kin selection requires innate powers of kin recognition, some theorists have tried to clarify the position in recent work. In his original papers on inclusive fitness theory, Hamilton pointed out a sufficiently high relatedness to favor altruistic behaviors could accrue in two ways: kin discrimination or limited dispersal. There is a huge theoretical literature on the possible role of limited dispersal reviewed by Platt and Bever and West al., as well as experimental evolution tests of these models. However, despite this, it is still sometimes claimed that kin selection requires kin discrimination. Furthermore, a large number of authors appear to have implicitly or explicitly assumed that kin discrimination is the only mechanism by which altruistic behaviors can be directed towards relatives. Here is a huge industry of papers reinventing limited dispersal as an explanation for cooperation. The mistakes in these areas seem to stem from the incorrect assumption that kin selection or indirect fitness benefits require kin discrimination, despite the fact that Hamilton pointed out the potential role of limited dispersal in his earliest papers on inclusive fitness theory. The assumption that kin recognition must be innate, and that cue-based mediation of social cooperation based on limited dispersal and shared developmental context are not sufficient, has obscured significant progress made in applying kin selection and inclusive fitness theory to a wide variety of species, including humans, on the basis of cue-based mediation of social bonding and social behaviors. Kin selection and human social patterns. Evolutionary psychologists, following Darwinian anthropologists' interpretation of kin selection theory, initially attempted to explain human altruistic behavior through kin selection by stating that behaviors that help a genetic relative are favored by natural selection. However, most evolutionary psychologists recognize that this common shorthand formulation is inaccurate. Any misunderstandings persist. In many cases, they result from conflating coefficient of relatedness and proportion of shared genes, which is a short step from the intuitively appealing, but incorrect, interpretation that animals tend to be altruistic toward those with whom they share a lot of genes. These misunderstandings don't just crop up occasionally, they are repeated in many writings, including undergraduate psychology textbooks, most of them in the field of social psychology, within sections describing evolutionary approaches to altruism. As with the earlier socio-biological forays into the cross-cultural data, typical approaches are not able to find explanatory fit with the findings of ethnographers insofar that human kinship patterns are not necessarily built upon blood ties. However, as Hamilton's later refinements of his theory make clear, it does not simply predict that genetically related individuals will inevitably recognize and engage in positive social behaviors with genetic relatives. Rather, indirect context-based mechanisms may have evolved, which in historical environments have met the inclusive fitness criterion. Consideration of the demographics of the typical evolutionary environment of any species is crucial to understanding the evolution of social behaviors. As Hamilton himself puts it, altruistic or selfish acts are only possible when a suitable social object is available. In this sense, behaviors are conditional from the start. Under this perspective, and noting the necessity of a reliable context of interaction being available, the data on how altruism is mediated in social mammals is readily made sense of. In social mammals, primates and humans, altruistic acts that meet the kin selection criterion are typically mediated by circumstantial cues such as shared developmental environment, familiarity and social bonding. That is, it is the context that mediates the development of the bonding process and the expression of the altruistic behaviors, not genetic relatedness per se. This interpretation thus is compatible with the cross-cultural ethnographic data and has been called nurture kinship.